Hello, everyone. Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 90th episode of the Writ Podcast. On June 26th, Toronto will be holding a Toronto mayoral by-election. It's actually going to be a huge election. Toronto is bigger than most provinces in Canada, and it's the first kind of election that we're seeing like this ever in Canada, such a huge by-election taking place between the general election. So there's a lot to talk about in this Toronto mayoral race. There's lots of candidates to go through to try to make some sense of it today. I'm joined by Matt Elliott. He's a columnist with the Toronto Star, and he is the publisher of the City Hall Watcher newsletter. Matt Elliott, thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, happy to be here, Eric. Great to chat about this.
Yeah, so I guess the place to start with is, how unusual is this kind of election in the first place, right? Because there was a municipal election not too long ago. These kinds of huge by-elections don't really take place in Canada, by my estimate, because I can't find any other example. This should be the biggest by-election that's ever taken place in Canada. But in the context of Toronto, how unprecedented, how unusual is this?
Very unusual. I mean, Toronto is, in a lot of ways, a young city as far as, the amalgamated city of Toronto goes. We haven't had that many elections since the late 90s when this sort of political apparatus was set up. So, we don't have a lot of precedent for anything, really. There was precedent for scandal in the mayor's office, I think it's fair to say. But this is the first time we've seen a mayor in the amalgamated city resign for a scandal and thus trigger a by-election. So uncharted waters, not something anybody was really expecting. We just went through a municipal election last fall. I was thinking, okay, a few years of covering committees and council reports and agendas and sort of the day-to-day of government at City Hall, and then all of a sudden, we're thrust back into an election. So unexpected, unprecedented, surprising.
We'll go through some of the contenders, but just a general comment. When I last checked earlier this week, there were 48 names on the list of candidates. That makes for a pretty long ballot. I know that Toronto tends to have these long ballots of names of candidates, virtually none of whom have any chance of winning. Is there anything unusual about the fact that there are so many names and also a decent amount of serious contenders?
Yeah, I was looking it up, and if you just look at like the large cities in North America, so north of like 2 million population, Toronto is one of the last to just do straight up first past the post with no runoff, no ranked ballots. People might have been sort of casually following elections in Chicago and New York and other cities lately, and a lot of those, at the very least, had a system where there'd be a first round where a bunch of candidates would run, and there'd be a second round where it would just be the top two. Toronto doesn't have anything like that. It's just straight up, we're going to have one election day. Whoever has the most votes on that day will be declared the mayor. So I think one of the things that attracts a lot of people to this race and to run for this office generally is the idea that, stranger things have happened. We could easily see a situation where we wake up on June 27th and it's kind of like Mayor Who, like somebody who just happened to get the right configuration of votes, maybe, in the 20% range, maybe less than that. And that could be enough, depending on how things shake out with so many candidates on the ballot.
Yeah, there was a poll that was put out by Main Street Research recently, and the leading candidate had about 15%, which is not a lot. There was the municipal election took place recently in Winnipeg, where I think the winner did get under 30% of the vote in a pretty crowded race. But even now, looking at where things are, 30% seems ambitious for any of the candidates. So let's start to get through some of these candidates. Now, sure. I don't follow Toronto municipal politics very closely. I don't live in Toronto. So, to me, I have to organize these into the usual kind of buckets of the progressives, the conservatives, the kind of centrist candidates. So let's start with the progressive candidates, sure. The contenders. We're not going to go through all 48 plus candidates, but among those that would come from the progressive wing, the people who would probably get more support from New Democrats, might actually get New Democrats to help them out in this campaign. Who would be the progressive candidates so far in this contest?
We had a new entry this week on Monday with Olivia Chow, who, is the spouse of former, the late leader, Jack Layton. Strong NDP ties, has run for mayor before in 2014 and came in third place. But, upon her entry to the race, and she was pretty well the only major candidate to try a strategy where it wasn't, register on day one. She waited. I don't know how much of that was strategic and how much of that was just, this was a surprise election. He needed to get things ready, but she made a bit of a splash because of that. But upon entry, even as late entry, she sort of immediately takes up a pretty strong, standard bearer for the NDP. I would say, maybe not for all of the progressive left, which I still think is a bit fractured amongst some of these candidates. But certainly, Olivia Chow's goal will be to try to really identify herself as the candidate that left-leaning voters want to select. Challenging her for that, you would have Councillor Josh Matlow, who's been a city councillor since 2010. Wasn't always somebody who sort of identified on like the left side of the spectrum at City Hall, but in recent years, especially in opposition to John Tory, has sort of identified himself more on that side of thing. So, he got in on day one, I think has really been gunning for those voters. So how he and Chow interact over the next few weeks will be super interesting. And then I would also throw in Anna Byelew, who is a former councillor, was a councillor until this past fall when she stepped aside. She is not necessarily running as a, out and out NDP orange team leftist, but is somebody who has racked up a lot of the union endorsements early on. And I think there's been some interesting strategy there because as, people sort of heard the rumors about Olivia Chow running, Byelew was out there getting these union endorsements. Now that they've endorsed, it's hard to go back and say, actually, we're going to go with this another new person. So that's been an interesting dynamic for me to watch.
In the past, because the 2014 election was probably the last really competitive one where you had people from the left, the center, the right. You had Doug Ford, John Tory, and Olivia Chow. In those past kind of cases where you have that kind of, where it's more of an open race, is there usually a bit of a progressive primary of candidates who are kind of kicking the tires and then eventually one emerges? Is it unusual that there are at least three who, at least in that Main Street poll, were, somewhere in the 10 to 15% range?
Not. I think there's been a lot of people who lament the fact that there's not more of like an unofficial progressive primary where everybody gets together in a more organized fashion and says, okay, this is going to be our candidate. There's a lot of different factions in there, and obviously ego plays a role. There's an old line that, the day after you get elected to Toronto City Council, you have somebody who's calling you up saying, hey, you'd make a great mayor one day. You should totally run. So there's a lot of these people who've sort of been primed that, they have what it takes to be mayor, and to dissuade them of that. And, from running in an open seat environment is challenging. What I would not be surprised to see is, candidates have until May 12th to drop out and not have their name on the ballot. So I think a lot of them will sort of see that date as a potential for, stepping aside. So in that sense, we might see a bit of a primary play out during the general election up until that deadline. And we saw a bit of that today where Gil Penalosa, who I didn't mention as a progressive candidate because he is officially not one, but he was the left candidate in last fall's election, and now he has declined to run in this election and instead has endorsed Olivia Chow. So would not be surprised if we see some other candidates, maybe not some of the name ones, but who knows, who decide that they're going to take their name off the ballot and endorse Chow or Matlow or Byelew or who knows.
Yeah, and you bring up Penalosa. I should point out, we are recording this on Wednesday, so if anything does happen between now and Friday, I'll probably add it in post. But other than that, sure. It is just an important note when we're speaking about when we're actually talking. So let's get to the centrists, the quote unquote liberals, I guess you could say, in Toronto. John Tory was probably that candidate back in 2014. I know it's not I know you can't really cut down the electorate that simply, but among the centrists, those kind of people that might get support from the Ontario Liberals, federal Liberals, people who are neither left nor right. What group of candidates do we have as the serious contenders there?
I would come back to Anna Bylau, who I mentioned when we were talking about the progressive candidates, though not necessarily because she's an out-and-out progressive, but just because of those union endorsements she's been getting. But I do think in terms of campaign strategy, Anna Bylau, as a former councillor, as somebody who was very close to John Tory, worked with him on the housing file at City Hall, which is, one of the biggest files, if not the biggest, for, all of his tenure, I think has really come up the middle as far as strategy goes. So you have union endorsements on one side, and then you also have, I'm somebody who's going to continue a lot of the work that John Tory was doing, which should be appealing to voters who like John Tory, which, if you look at the numbers in the last couple elections, is like 60+% of the voting population of Toronto. So kind of makes sense that you would go after that group of voters. I think that's one of the most prominent centrist candidates, or somebody who's trying to brand themselves as sort of in that John Tory mode. And then you also have Councillor Brad Bradford, who is a sitting councillor like Josh Matlow, but unlike Josh Matlow, who was often at odds with John Tory, Brad Bradford is somebody who was on John Tory's team, and has similar designs on convincing that pool of John Tory voters to come out for him. I think the difference between Bylau and Bradford is Bylau is sort of saying, I'm a centrist that's going to build this bridge to the left, and Bradford is a centrist that's trying to build a bridge to the right. He's definitely come out of the gate with a more sort of right-leaning campaign, while also still trying to hold that center of things. So I think those are the two. There's a bit of a wild card in there in Mitzi Hunter, who is a Liberal MPP, or former Liberal MPP. Hasn't really defined where she's going to end up on policy yet, aside from saying the things that centrists tend to say about, working with all parties and all people and all that stuff. So I do think that, if you come into this race sort of as generic candidate who wants to win, the most obvious strategic path is, okay, John Tory was popular. Let's sort of stick with that mold of things. Whether that's going to resonate with people is sort of an open question with me, because I do think that, towards the end of Tory's tenure and since, there's been sort of a general realization that maybe things in the city aren't exactly going great, with some of the issues that we've been seeing pop up.
So does this mean that there isn't really a continuation candidate, or at least a single one, that if people are just looking for things to keep going in the way that they were going before, the drama of John Tory's resignation, that they don't really have a clear way to go just yet?
Not just yet. I do think that Bylau and Bradford are the two that are best positioned to sort of be that candidate, and maybe each of them thought that they would sort of inherit that mantle. I know that a lot of people who were staffers in John Tory's office are on the Bylau side of things, and she's come out of the gate with stronger poll numbers in the polls that we've seen, for whatever that's worth, when people are polling, still in like the teens as like the leading candidates. So I do think it'll be very interesting to see how that shakes out between Bylau and Bradford, because I do think, ultimately when we get down to the brass tacks and it gets close to election day, I think, people are hoping that there's sort of going to be like one left candidate, one center candidate, and one right candidate. And that's how elections have broken down in the past in Toronto. But, this, like we said to start this conversation, there's a lot of unprecedentedness to this race.
So then let's talk about who could be the right candidate. And by that, I mean the conservative candidate, not in terms of the correct one. But, you had Doug Ford, who was obviously had a strong campaign in 2014. Rob Ford was able to win before. So it's possible for conservatives to be very competitive. Mm-hmm. And if they do get all the vote together, if we do have this fractured race, then anybody who can get all of the vote on one of those wings can probably win. But who would those contenders be on the right, on the conservative side of things?
I think we got to start with Mark Saunders, who is the former police chief, who has really come out of the gate as the sort of law and order, tough on crime candidate, which I think is designed to resonate with a lot of right-leaning or conservative voters. I mean, Saunders himself ran as a PC candidate in the provincial election unsuccessfully, but so he has that party affiliation, has a lot of conservatives working for him. So, I think he has that lane, but just as I've done already with Bilau, I also want to highlight Brad Bradford here because he is also somebody who's got some pretty prominent conservative backroom people working for him, including Corey Tanaik and some others. So, again, you sort of have differing strategies as far as appealing to conservative voters in Toronto. I think Brad Bradford is trying to thread a needle where he appeals to both centrists and conservative leaning voters, whereas Mark Saunders, former police chief, has come in as, I am the sort of choice for conservatives in this election. And I think that's played out really interestingly over the last week because the Bradford campaign has really sort of gone after the Saunders campaign. It's like they've been firing missiles at them, just sort of going after his record, putting out attack ads, videos online, this kind of thing. So I do think there's this idea that, if the Bradford campaign can sort of hurt Saunders' numbers in the polls or in the eyes of voters, then they might be able to inherit that side of the electorate and also hold some of the Tory voters, which, if you do the math on it, would probably be, more than enough to win on June 26th.
It's interesting you mentioned the tough on crime approach because you can look at what happened in Vancouver municipal election last year where Ken Sim was able to win on that, and he did very well. But then you have, and you also just mentioned Chicago,
Yep.
Where you had a candidate who was running as a tough on crime candidate. It was two Democrats against each other, but the tough on crime candidate lost. So it's not necessarily a winning path. Though if you are only having to get to 25 or 30% of the vote, then that certainly mixes things up quite a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think, getting up and saying I'm going to be tough on crime is a message that's always going to resonate with a certain percentage of the electorate. I think another percentage of the electorate is going to hear that slogan and say, okay, so like, what does that mean? Like, nobody likes crime. Everybody would like crime to be lower, but like, what is your actual plan for reducing crime? And that is something that I think Saunders has struggled to really articulate, but it's early days. Still, it's really challenging as the mayor of Toronto because you have control over the police budget to a degree, but you can't go out there and say to the police chief, I want you to do this and focus on this area and all this stuff. Like, we have some pretty strict rules about separation of powers and not being able to direct the police. So I think there's going to be some percentage of the electorate that's going to be looking for more than just the tough on crime slogan. But, again, as we keep saying, you don't need a whole lot of percentage to win this race, most likely.
Are there any other kind of wild card candidates? Because in the past there have been, not perhaps ones that have a chance to win, but who could grab some attention, be some names that people would recognize, that just the name recognition alone could help them get a couple votes.
Giorgio Mammalidi, who is a former city councillor who also ran for mayor in 2010 before dropping out, and was known throughout his tenure at City Hall for being a wild card in like the purest sense of the term. Mammalidi has had ideas in the past, like let's take Toronto Island and turn it into like a red light district where all things are legal. Let's build the world's largest flagpole was one of his major passion projects for a long time at City Hall.
Couldn't you just put a flag on the top of CN Tower, or why do you need a separate flagpole?
Wow, we need ideas like that in the city, Eric. We got to get you in Toronto. The search me on that whole thing. It was a very long saga that also involved some allegations of corruption. And but Mammalidi is very good at getting attention, and I would not be surprised if he's able to generate some headlines for himself. His most recent success at local office was to become the mayor of Wasaga Beach, which is a beach town just outside of Toronto in last fall's election. I believe he came third. So now after that plan A didn't work, he's back to plan B, which I guess is being mayor of Toronto. It's good to have a fallback.
Yeah, from Wasabi Beach, right?
Absolutely. So that is one potential that we'll probably hear about. On the sort of more serious side of things, Chloe Brown is the person who came third in last fall's election against John Tory and Gil Penalosa. Coming in third, you sort of hear that and think, oh, okay, whatever. She came third, but considering the limited amount of resources she had, the vote total she racked up, especially in the areas where she campaigned, was super impressive. And I'm very interested to see what she's able to do the second time around with presumably more resources, both in terms of volunteers and in terms of money. In a crowded field like this, you never know, but I think, she is one of the younger candidates. She's somebody who can speak very confidently about sort of technology and the role it could play in local government. Very sort of serious, policy-driven candidate. So again, doesn't come in with a name recognition that some of these other people have, but if there was to be somebody that I could see just pulling one of those surprise victories out, or at very least very surprising strong showings that wouldn't be necessarily a surprise for those of us who are paying close attention, Chloe Brown is the name that I would sort of highlight.
What would be the kind of path for some of these candidates, the bigger candidates? Because when you talk about how many, you got 2.5 progressives, you got 1.5 conservatives, and maybe 2 centrists, depending on which way they end up trying to go. It sounds to me like there's a better path on the right or in the center than there is on the left. If it's a little bit split and progressives have had a bit of a harder time winning than, the centrists or the right-wing candidates. So what's the math for the winning candidate in this case? How do they put that together? How many conservatives, liberals, New Democrats, left, right, center are there in Toronto?
I really think, if you were to break it down in very simple terms, you're probably looking at, if you look at what like Rob Ford got 47% of the vote in 2010, which was a commanding victory. And I don't think you could look at that Rob Ford victory in 2010 and say, oh, that's because of conservative voters. Like he was able to get basically all the city's conservative voters and a bunch of the centrists. If you look at Doug Ford in 2014, who took over for Rob Ford's campaign when Rob Ford was diagnosed with cancer, Doug Ford came in with about a third of the vote. So like 33, 34%, somewhere in that range. Was generally, Rob Ford was polling in that range as well. So I've always seen that as sort of like the ceiling for the really sort of, you want to call them like true blue conservative voters, like the people in Toronto that are looking for a conservative candidate municipally and will come out for that candidate is probably about a third of the electorate. So then I think in simple terms, you could also say that, maybe the NDP ceiling is sort of around that range as well, and the Liberals might also get a third. I think probably the Liberals have more than the NDP, but, for simple math, think about like a third. So I do think for a lot of campaigns, and we've seen this with Bradford, we've seen this with Bylau, and I think we'll see it with Chow, is that, you want to shore up your third that you think you can get most of, and then also build some bridges to one of the other camps. So you'll either, if you're in the center, you'll reach to the left, you'll reach to the right. If you're on the left, you'll reach to the center. And if you're on the right, you will reach to the middle. But of course, where that math gets all messy is, what do you need to win this election? And I've heard some people say, the winner is probably going to come in, in like the 30% range. I've heard some people say it could be like the mid 20s or low 20s. Some people even saying maybe it's less than 20% wins this election. And if that's the case, then a lot of this electoral strategy just goes out the window. The Chow campaign, for example, could, do some math and say, okay, in 2014, yes, we came third, but we got, more than 200,000 votes and we got like 23%. And maybe, that was a third place campaign. Maybe this time, if we run the exact same campaign and get the exact same results, we win. Very plausible, right? So As far as campaign strategy goes, I still think people are going to approach it like they always do, but we have, the real unpredictability of not knowing what the winning number is going to be and really having no idea.
It also means the ground game turnout is going to be hugely important because this election is taking place the Monday before the Canada Day long weekend. So what's going to get people out to vote in this municipal election? When turnout was really low in the last one, in part because everybody recognized it wasn't competitive, but it's not going to be this time. People will know this is a competitive race, but still, it's coming at a time. What's going to get people out to go vote a week before Canada Day long weekend?
Yeah, I do think, we will see some issues really galvanize people as much as they can be galvanized by this race. I've been a bit surprised early on that the development of Ontario Place, which is sort of a big waterfront, was a theme park on Toronto's waterfront for many decades and then fell into disrepair and was closed. And now there's a provincial plan to build a spa there. And that has suddenly emerged as one of the big issues in the earlier days of this mayoral race, which is not something I necessarily would have banked on, but it is something that people have strong opinions about. I wonder how much crime will resonate with people. I think if this election had been run a couple of months ago when we were seeing a lot of headlines about violence on the TTC, that might have been something that would have really dominated. Now, the numbers seem to be going in a better direction. So where will that be at the end of June? But I do think if you look at the history of Toronto elections, it does tend to be the case that we end up really hyper-focusing on one, maybe two issues. So, like the bridge to the island airport was a huge issue in the 2003 race, which was the race John Tory lost when he first ran for mayor of Toronto. But, that wasn't the biggest issue facing Toronto at the time, wasn't the most important issue facing Toronto at the time, but it sort of became the issue that defined that race. And so, I would not at all be surprised if we really just comes down to one or two issues like that, and whatever the views are become sort of a proxy for how people vote.
We'll finish on this. Different cities have different kind of roles for the mayor. Some of them they're the first among equals on council. Others, they have a lot more powers. Different cities have different, some have police forces, some don't. So just if someone's in Toronto, but also someone's not in Toronto, how important is the election? How important is the role of mayor in Toronto?
Yeah, I think it is incredibly important, and I was very disappointed with the turnout numbers that we posted in last fall's race, considering how important local government is. Not that I blame the voters for it, because, it was a pretty sleepy race in the end with a pretty obvious result. But, if you walk outside your house in Toronto, the first, say, dozen problems you encounter are going to be related to the municipal government, it is the level of government that affects our lives more than any others. And even in Toronto, where, we have a city hall that is very beholden to the provincial government in a lot of ways, the decisions that are made at City Hall are still way more likely to affect the day-to-day lives of citizens than decisions that are made at Queen's Park or in Ottawa. So my pitch is always, if you make a list of the things that bother you on a day-to-day basis about, where you live and the infrastructure you interact with, most of those problems are going to come back to a municipal decision. So I would encourage people to really not just write this off as whatever, it doesn't really matter. This is the level of government that matters more than the others in a lot of ways. So who we select to lead us is incredibly important.
Yeah, we'll see if interest is going to increase as the race gets closer. If it is a very competitive one, I think that will help turnout. It'll help get people engaged. And if we still have a race at the end where you have 6 or 7 people who have an outside chance of winning, that could be a surprising and interesting election night. So it is just about 2 months to go for the election, but we're already getting all the candidates in. We already have some movements just happening in the last couple of days. So, Matt, I really appreciate you coming to explain it. And for anybody who's watching or listening, you should check out his newsletter, The City Hall Watcher. So thanks so much, Matt. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. This was fun.